At 17 minutes past 8 on a cold Saturday morning, someone started pounding on the front door hard enough to rattle the glass in its frame. Calder Wynn set his coffee down on the counter and walked toward the sound, still in the same flannel shirt he'd slept in, and when he opened the door, he found 2 police officers standing on his porch. Just behind them, arms folded across her chest, stood Marla Voss, the HOA board member who had spent the last 3 months trying to force him off his own property. She looked past the officers and pointed at his driveway like she was presenting evidence in a courtroom. "That's him," she said. "He's violating the HOA order." Calder almost laughed. Almost. Because she had no idea what was sitting inside the black folder he was already holding in his hand. One of the officers, a broad-shouldered man with a name tag reading Delgado, asked Calder to step outside and explain himself. Calder didn't step outside. He simply held the folder out toward him instead. Delgado opened it, glanced down at the first page, and his expression changed in less than 5 seconds. He flipped to the second page, then the third. He looked up, past Calder, toward Marla, and his voice had lost most of its earlier friendliness. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "did you actually file this complaint yourself?" Marla blinked. "Of course I did," she said. "That's my job." Delgado didn't answer right away. He kept reading. Behind him, his partner Reyes glanced at Marla and then at the folder, trying to read the room the way officers learn to do within the first 30 seconds of any call. "Is there a problem?" Marla asked, her voice rising just slightly, the confidence in it starting to sound a little forced now. Delgado didn't look up from the page in front of him. "Give me a second, ma'am," he said. "Just give me a second." Calder stood in the doorway with his arms loose at his sides, saying nothing, watching the 2 officers read through paperwork that Marla had never once bothered to ask him for in 3 months of letters and warnings. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. He had learned a long time ago that the truth didn't need help from him to land. To most of the street, Calder was a background presence, the kind of neighbor people waved to without ever learning much about. He didn't attend block parties, and he never joined the group chat some of the younger families had started for organizing carpools and lost pets. He kept to a routine: coffee at 6, work by 7, home again by 5 most days, weekends spent on whatever project the house currently needed. Nobody on that street would have described him as difficult. If anything, most of them would have said the opposite, that he was the sort of person you'd want living next to you precisely because he never caused trouble and never expected anyone else to either. Calder Wynn was 41 years old and lived alone in a house he had bought with his own money and rebuilt almost entirely with his own hands. He was not a man who enjoyed conflict, and he rarely raised his voice or explained himself twice. The neighbors on his street knew him as the quiet guy who kept his lawn edged, his gutters clean, and his opinions to himself. He almost never showed up to HOA meetings, and on the rare occasions he did, he sat in the back row near the door and said nothing at all. Marla Voss was 48 years old, polished, and endlessly confident in her own authority. On the surface, she seemed warm, the kind of woman who brought muffins to new neighbors and remembered everyone's birthday without being asked. Underneath that surface, she believed the Homeowners Association existed to control nearly everything within its borders, and she treated every disagreement as a personal test of her power. In the months before that Saturday morning, she had sent Calder warning after warning. First it was the fence, which she claimed was 2 inches too tall. Then it was the paint on his trim, which she insisted was the wrong shade of white. Then it was a truck he had parked in his own driveway for 4 days while replacing a transmission. Then it was the hours he was allowed to run tools while repairing his roof after a storm. Then, finally, it was a small wooden structure he had built behind his house, a simple workshop with a slanted roof and 1 window. Every single time a letter arrived, Calder asked her the same simple question in writing. "Show me the exact clause in the covenant that says that." Every single time, she found a reason to avoid answering directly, and every single time her irritation sharpened just a little more, because for the first time in years, someone on her street was refusing to be afraid of her. The fence letter had arrived first, back in early spring, taped to his door in a bright yellow envelope that made it impossible to miss. It claimed his new cedar fence exceeded the maximum allowed height by 2 full inches, a detail so specific that Calder assumed, reasonably, that someone had actually measured it. When he called the number listed on the letter, Marla answered herself. "I measured it personally," she told him. 2 inches over. Easy. Calder thanked her, hung up, and drove to the hardware store the same afternoon to buy a tape measure of his own. The fence measured exactly 48 inches, precisely at the limit written in the covenant, not a single inch over. He mailed Marla a photograph of the tape measure pressed against the top rail, along with a copy of the relevant page from the covenant, highlighted in yellow. She never responded to that letter. 3 weeks later, The paint complaint arrived instead, as if the fence had simply been forgotten the moment it stopped being useful. That morning, standing behind the two officers, Marla believed she had finally won. She told them Calder had ignored a direct HOA order, that he had threatened the safety of the neighborhood, that he was, in her exact words, becoming a serious problem that the whole community was worried about. Calder didn't argue with a single syllable of it. He simply turned, walked back inside for a moment, and returned with the same folder already in hand. Delgado flipped it open again, more slowly this time, reading each page with real attention. His partner, a younger officer named Reyes, leaned in to read over his shoulder. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Marla still believed she was standing on solid ground. She had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath her had already given way. To understand how Marla Voss ended up standing on a stranger's porch with two police officers on a cold Saturday morning, it helps to go back roughly a year to the point when she quietly became the loudest voice on the entire board. She had originally joined the HOA as an ordinary member, someone who volunteered because nobody else wanted the responsibility of collecting dues and scheduling landscaping bids. When the previous board president resigned without much explanation, citing personal reasons that nobody pushed her to elaborate on, Marla stepped into the vacuum almost overnight. Within a few months, she had become the person other members deferred to on nearly every decision, large or small. She had a small collection of phrases she repeated so often that neighbors began to recognize them the moment she opened her mouth. The board has decided. Everyone follows the same rules. You don't get special treatment just because you disagree with us. The irony was that Calder never once asked for special treatment. All he ever asked was that the HOA actually follow what was written in its own governing documents, nothing more and nothing less. When Calder started reading through the covenant line by line one rainy weekend, sitting at his kitchen table with a highlighter and a legal pad, he discovered something Marla clearly hadn't expected anyone to check. Several of the rules she cited so confidently simply did not exist anywhere in writing. There was no clause about fence height measured to the inch. There was no clause restricting paint color to a specific approved list. There was no clause limiting how long a vehicle could sit in a private driveway. Instead of correcting course when Calder pointed this out politely in an email, Marla shifted tactics entirely. She stopped treating the disagreement as a simple policy question and started treating it as a personal battle she intended to win. The letters kept coming, one after another, each one slightly more formal and slightly more threatening in tone than the last. She claimed his property was dragging down what she called community standards, even though his lawn was better maintained than half the homes on the block, including her own. Calder stayed quiet through all of it, mostly because he didn't see the point in arguing with someone who wasn't actually listening to a word he said. What he didn't fully realize yet was that his silence wasn't calming Marla down at all. It was making her angrier by the week, because in her mind, silence from a homeowner was supposed to mean surrender, not patience. She had built her entire identity around being the person whose word carried weight, the one who could send a single letter and watch a homeowner scramble to comply within days. Calder didn't scramble. He didn't apologize. He didn't even seem particularly bothered by any of it, and that unbothered calm felt, to Marla, like a direct challenge to everything she had built for herself on that board. So she escalated. She sent what she called a final notice, printed on official HOA letterhead and mailed with a signature-required stamp, demanding that Calder remove the small wooden structure behind his house within 72 hours, or face what she vaguely described only as further action. Calder read the letter twice at his kitchen table, turning it over in his hands as if checking for something he might have missed. He wasn't angry. He was, if anything, almost relieved, because he already knew exactly what was wrong with it, and he knew that Marla had just handed him something far more useful than she could possibly realize. What Marla did not know about Calder's house went back much further than the 72-hour deadline she had just issued. Calder wasn't a flashy man, and he never once talked about money at neighborhood gatherings, but before buying this house, he had spent nearly 15 years working in construction and property management, which meant he understood deeds, surveys, and county filings far better than almost anyone else on that street, including most of the people who currently sat on the HOA board. He had purchased the property years before the surrounding development expanded to its current size, back when the boundaries of the neighborhood looked very different on paper than they did today. When the Homeowners Association was formally established, a handful of older parcels, including a portion of land directly behind Calder's house, were never fully absorbed into the new covenant the way everyone simply assumed they had been. Calder had kept every relevant document organized in a single black folder for years, updated whenever something new came in: the original deed, the property survey, stamped by the county surveyor's office, the county land records, printed and dated, the HOA's original declaration from the year the association was formed, Every amendment filed after it, in order. Marla had never once asked to see any of it. She operated purely on assumption, convinced that whatever she declared to be HOA policy simply was HOA policy, no verification required, no second opinion necessary. Calder had, on more than one occasion, formally requested that the board produce the original covenant so everyone could review the actual language together in a public meeting. Every single time, Marla found a reason to delay the request, citing scheduling conflicts or missing paperwork, and every single time she quietly assumed Calder was just stalling for time because he had no real argument to make. The truth was almost the opposite of what she assumed. A portion of Calder's land sat outside the authority Marla kept insisting she had, according to documents that had been sitting in a county office the entire time, available to anyone who bothered to look. But Calder hadn't said a word about any of it yet. He wanted to see exactly how far she was willing to push before he pushed back with the truth. He had a reason for waiting, beyond simple patience. Years earlier, in a different job in a different state, Calder had watched a coworker win an argument too early, waving proof around before anyone had fully committed to the wrong position, and the other side had simply backed off, apologized quietly, and gone right on doing the same thing to somebody else the following month. Calder didn't want an apology from Marla. He wanted the record to be complete enough that nobody could ever quietly walk it back later. So every time a new letter arrived, he filed it. Every time she made a claim in a meeting, he asked a neighbor who had attended to describe exactly what was said. He wasn't building a defense. He was building a history, one piece at a time, the kind that speaks for itself without anyone needing to raise their voice over it. Before that hallway conversation, Marla had already tried a handful of smaller tactics to wear Calder down, each one a little more pointed than the last. She had once left a handwritten note on his windshield instead of mailing a letter, just to make sure he understood the message was personal. She had asked a landscaping crew working nearby to take photographs of his side yard without his knowledge, later presenting the pictures to the board as evidence of neglect. Even though the yard had simply been mid-project on a Tuesday afternoon, she had brought up his name at 2 separate meetings where he wasn't present to respond, framing every mention in a way designed to make the other members nod along without asking too many questions. None of it worked the way she expected, because Calder simply kept responding the same way every time, calmly, in writing, asking for the specific rule being cited. Not long after issuing her 72-hour ultimatum, Marla discovered that Calder had made no move whatsoever to remove the structure. She mentioned it, almost offhandedly, to another board member named Patricia while they stood in the hallway after a meeting, and her tone had already shifted from irritated to something closer to combative. "Fine," she said, her voice low and tight. "If he wants a fight, I'll give him one." Patricia, caught off guard, asked what exactly she meant by that. Marla didn't answer. She just walked away. That single sentence, casually spoken in a hallway between 2 women holding paper cups of coffee, would later matter far more than either of them could have predicted that afternoon. Marla didn't wait long to make good on that threat. She called an emergency HOA meeting for the following Tuesday evening and stood in front of the other board members describing Calder as, in her exact words, a problem homeowner who refused to respect the community he lived in. A few members hesitated, unsure whether the situation really warranted that level of concern over a small backyard structure, but Marla had come prepared. She had brought a folder of her own, filled with carefully chosen photographs taken from angles that made his property look far messier and more chaotic than it actually was, close-ups of a stack of lumber, a tarp folded near the fence, tools left out overnight after a long day of work. It worked. The board voted, 4-2, to authorize another formal violation notice. Howard was one of the 2 who voted against it, and he later admitted he had gone along with Marla on nearly every other vote that year, simply because arguing with her rarely felt worth the energy it cost. That, more than anything, was how Marla had managed to hold on to power for as long as she had. Not because most people agreed with her, but because most people found it easier to nod along than to sit through the friction of pushing back. Calder responded in writing that same week, calmly and specifically, asking for 4 things. The exact clause being violated, word for word. Documented evidence of the violation itself, the legal authority under which the HOA claimed to be acting, and a copy of the meeting minutes where this decision had been formally voted on and recorded. Marla never provided a complete answer to any of the 4 requests. Instead, she told other board members privately that Calder was, in her words, challenging the authority of the association itself, as if simply asking for documentation were somehow an act of open rebellion against the neighborhood. Calder didn't argue back publicly, and he didn't raise his voice or post an angry letter on anyone's door. He simply kept doing what he had already been doing for months, saving every email, every letter, every date, every small inconsistency in a growing timeline, building a record so thorough that anyone who eventually looked at it would understand the entire situation within minutes. The pattern was becoming obvious to anyone paying close attention. The more Marla talked, the more evidence Calder quietly accumulated against her, page by page, without ever needing to say a single accusing word out loud. Frustrated that her escalation still hadn't produced the surrender she expected, Marla made a promise in front of the board that she would come to regret almost immediately. "Tomorrow morning," she announced, standing at the front of the room, "I'm calling the police." One member, a retired schoolteacher named Howard, asked, reasonably enough, for what exactly. Marla's answer was chilling in its honesty, and nobody in that room forgot it. "He'll give us a reason," she said, as if the reason itself were entirely optional and could simply be invented later if it turned out to be necessary. The next morning, Marla followed through on her promise. She called the police and described Calder in terms designed to sound alarming rather than accurate, telling the dispatcher he was defying a formal HOA order, that he had a documented history of non-compliance, that his behavior felt threatening to nearby residents, and that she personally was worried he was becoming unstable. 2 officers were dispatched to his address. Calder opened the door calmly, without any hint of nerves, dressed the same way he always was on a weekend, and one of the officers began asking routine questions about the situation, while the other took notes. Calder didn't launch into a long defense of himself. He asked one simple question of his own. "Would you like to see the documentation?" he said. Before either officer could answer, Marla pushed forward from the sidewalk, insisting they order Calder to remove the structure on the spot, right then, in front of everyone. The officers explained, patiently and more than once, that they weren't there to settle a civil property dispute between a homeowner and an association board. That wasn't police business. Calder handed over the folder anyway. Inside were dozens of pages, each one labeled and dated in his own neat handwriting, laid out in a way that made the entire history instantly readable to anyone with a few minutes to spare. Delgado began flipping through the HOA declaration first, then the property survey, then the county land records, stamped and certified. He glanced over at Reyes, and the look on his face had shifted from routine boredom into something much more focused and alert. "This isn't what she told us on the phone," he said quietly, almost to himself. Even at that point, standing on the driveway in the cold morning air, Marla didn't seem to grasp how much danger she was actually standing in. "That paperwork doesn't matter," she said, her voice sharpening with every word. "The HOA owns the rules here, not the county." Delgado looked at her directly, his tone now noticeably colder than it had been 5 minutes earlier. "That's not how any of this works, ma'am," he replied. And for the first time that morning, Marla's confidence flickered, just slightly, like a bulb about to burn out. She tried again, switching tactics the way she always did when one approach stopped working. "He's been hostile toward the board for months," she said. "Ask anyone on the street." Reyes glanced at Calder, who hadn't moved from the doorway and hadn't said a word since handing over the folder. "Sir, has anyone on this street ever filed a complaint against you for hostile behavior?" Reyes asked. Calder shook his head once. "Not that I've heard," he said. "I've never even raised my voice at a meeting." Delgado looked back down at the folder, at a stapled stack of Calder's written requests, each one polite, each one dated, each one asking for nothing more than a citation from the covenant. He closed the folder halfway and looked at Marla. "This reads like the opposite of hostile, ma'am," he said. "This reads like someone who kept asking you nicely for months." Calder walked the officers through the documents in plain, unemotional language, laying out the boundaries of the disputed land, the exact date the HOA had been formally established according to county filings, the limits written directly into the original covenant, and a handful of amendments that had never actually been filed correctly at all. He didn't need to raise his voice or argue his case with emotion, because the paperwork spoke clearly enough entirely on its own. The officers began to realize just how much of what Marla had told the dispatcher didn't line up with what was actually sitting in front of them in black and white. Delgado turned to her and asked whether she had personally verified any of these claims before making that phone call. Marla stumbled over her answer and started trying to shift blame onto the rest of the board, even though none of them were present to defend or contradict a single word she said. She insisted she was only doing what was necessary to protect the community from disorder. Calder had already opened a second document by then, an old email Marla had sent to another board member weeks earlier, one she had clearly forgotten still existed somewhere. In it, written plainly in her own words, was a sentence that undercut every excuse she had just offered to 2 uniformed officers. "If he refuses, I'll find another way to force him out." It was a stark, unmistakable contradiction to the story she was now telling on his porch. Calder went further. He mentioned a recorded HOA meeting, one that had been quietly transcribed by a volunteer secretary months earlier, where Marla herself had said, almost casually, that the police would scare him into compliance faster than another letter ever could. Reyes looked over at her, his tone now noticeably colder than it had been at any point that morning. "Did you call us today because you genuinely believed a crime was taking place?" he asked. "Or because you wanted leverage over a private property dispute?" Marla opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Delgado closed the folder completely and handed it back to Calder. "Sir," he said, "we're not going to be taking any action here today. This is a civil matter between you and the association, and honestly, based on what's in this folder, it looks like most of it should never have gotten this far in the first place." He turned to Marla next, his voice level but firm in a way that left no room for argument. "Ma'am, I'd strongly recommend you loop in your full board before making a call like this again," he said. "Filing a false report, even one you believe to be true, can carry consequences of its own." Marla's face had gone pale by then, the color draining out of it the way it does when someone realizes, in real time, that the story they told themselves for months doesn't survive contact with daylight. She didn't respond. She just stood there on the edge of Calder's driveway, holding a set of photographs that suddenly felt useless in her hands. Word of the incident moved through the neighborhood faster than anyone expected for a Saturday morning. A woman 2 doors down had watched the entire thing unfold from her kitchen window, and by early afternoon she had mentioned it to 3 other neighbors while walking her dog past the mailboxes. Nobody was gossiping out of malice. Most of them simply couldn't believe it. Marla, of all people, standing in a driveway while 2 police officers quietly sided with the man she'd been trying to push out for months. Patricia heard about it before Marla ever called her directly, and when the phone finally rang that afternoon, she almost didn't answer it. Marla tried calling several board members that same afternoon, hoping desperately that someone would back up the story she had told the police that morning. Not a single person was willing to confirm it. One board member, Howard, told her flatly over the phone that she had promised everyone she had already verified all of it before making that call in the first place. Marla began to unravel a little, trying to redirect blame toward Calder, insisting to anyone who would listen that he had somehow provoked all of this himself through his stubbornness. Calder never raised his voice or attacked her back in return. He simply said quietly, standing in his own doorway, "I never asked for any of this. I just wanted the rules followed the way they're actually written." Around that same time, another HOA member named Ray Doss arrived at Calder's house carrying a physical copy of the original covenant, one he had pulled from a filing cabinet in his garage. After reviewing it line by line at Calder's kitchen table, Ray admitted publicly, later that week, that Marla had misrepresented several of its provisions on more than one occasion over the past year. Once that admission was out in the open, other homeowners started coming forward with their own stories. Violation notices they had quietly paid without question. Warnings they had complied with out of simple fear that, in hindsight, never actually matched anything written in the governing documents at all. Marla, who had spent months positioning herself as the person pursuing justice against a difficult homeowner, suddenly found herself the one being questioned by nearly everyone around her. A board member finally asked her directly, in front of a small crowd gathered near the mailboxes, how many homeowners she had pressured this same exact way over the years. Marla said nothing at all. She just stared at the pavement. As more people started paying attention to the timeline Calder had built, he revealed, calmly, and without any triumph in his voice, that he had quietly been researching the HOA's broader history for several weeks, long before that Saturday morning had even happened. His situation, it turned out, was far from an isolated incident within the neighborhood. Certain fees and violation notices had been applied inconsistently across the entire community, with some homes facing immediate penalties for minor issues, while others, often owned by people close to Marla personally, were quietly overlooked for the exact same infractions. Calder wasn't interested in throwing around vague accusations without proof, so instead he laid out a clear, printed timeline for anyone who wanted to see it. Every document dated, every decision signed, every inconsistency easy to trace from one point to the next without needing him to explain a thing. Several emails pulled from a public records request Calder had quietly filed with the county weeks earlier showed a clear pattern of Marla using her position on the board less like a public responsibility and more like a personal tool for settling scores. One email in particular stood out to Ellen when she eventually reviewed it, sent by Marla to a landscaping contractor nearly a year before Calder had ever received his first letter. In it, Marla asked the contractor to prioritize her own street corner for a beautification grant the HOA had received, while quietly deprioritizing a request from a homeowner 2 blocks over who had recently disagreed with her at a public meeting about parking. It wasn't proof of anything criminal. It didn't need to be. It was simply one more brick in a pattern that, once people started looking for it, was suddenly everywhere. Homeowners began requesting a special meeting to review the entire situation properly, with several signatures collected on a petition within just 2 days. Marla realized, somewhere around this point, that this had grown far beyond anything she could still control through charm or intimidation alone. Calder wasn't the first person she had pushed too hard over the years. He was simply the first one who had kept every single piece of proof along the way, organized and dated, ready to be handed over the moment it mattered. As the calls for a full audit grew louder throughout the neighborhood, Marla looked over at Calder standing quietly near his own mailbox and understood, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that she had picked the wrong person to underestimate. The HOA scheduled a special meeting to address everything that had come to light, and the community room was fuller than it had been in years, folding chairs pulled out from a storage closet to accommodate everyone who showed up. Homeowners pressed Marla with question after question, one after another, and she tried to explain, her voice growing less steady with each answer, that she had simply been doing her job as she understood it. Calder didn't stand up to make a speech. He stayed seated near the back of the room, hands folded in his lap, and when someone finally asked him directly to speak, he offered only the documents themselves, letting them be projected onto a screen for everyone in the room to read for themselves, one page at a time. Line by line, people saw exactly how Marla had twisted the language of the covenant to suit whatever outcome she wanted that week. How she had used 2 police officers as a pressure tactic rather than a genuine safety concern. How she had misrepresented facts to both the board and to law enforcement without hesitation. How she had threatened a private homeowner, in his own words on his own porch, in an effort to force his compliance with rules that didn't even exist. A woman near the front, a longtime resident named Denise, who had lived on the street for almost 20 years, stood up during the discussion and said something that seemed to settle over the room. "She sent me a letter 2 years ago about a shed I never even built," Denise said. "I paid the fine anyway because I didn't want the trouble. I want that money back." A murmur ran through the crowd, and 2 other homeowners raised their hands almost immediately, describing warnings they had quietly complied with rather than fight. Howard, still on the board at that point, asked Marla directly whether the association had ever refunded a contested fine in the time she had been in charge. Marla said she would need to check the records. Everyone in the room understood exactly what that answer meant. A vote was called, and Marla was removed from her position on the board that same evening, by a wide margin that surprised even the people who had voted against her. An independent review of the association's recent history was approved unanimously, with a retired accountant named Ellen Pruitt volunteering to lead it. Every violation notice connected to Calder's property was formally rescinded within the week, and Ellen's review would go on to uncover several more fines that were quietly refunded to homeowners over the following month. Someone in the crowd asked him afterward, as people were folding up chairs and heading toward the parking lot, why he hadn't pushed back against her sooner, months earlier when the first letter arrived. Calder answered simply, without any bitterness in his voice at all. "Because I knew eventually she'd document everything for me," he said. "I just had to wait for her to write it down." Just when everyone assumed the story had finally reached its natural end, Calder was handed a plain white envelope by a county clerk the following week. Inside was an official letter, and its contents would settle the matter for good, more completely than even Calder had expected. The letter confirmed, in formal legal language, Calder's clear right to the portion of land the HOA had spent months insisting he didn't control at all. The association's older records were corrected to reflect the true, documented boundaries going forward. Several vague and inconsistently enforced rules within the covenant were flagged for a full rewrite by the new board, with a homeowner committee formed to review every future amendment before it could be approved. A new board was elected in the weeks that followed, made up largely of people who had watched the entire situation unfold firsthand and had no interest in repeating it. Ray Doss, the neighbor who had first brought the physical covenant to Calder's kitchen table, agreed to serve as treasurer, and Patricia stayed on as secretary, this time keeping detailed public minutes for every single meeting, posted for anyone on the street to review. Under the new leadership, the HOA adopted a formal policy requiring every future violation notice to include a specific factual basis in writing, documented evidence attached to the notice itself, a clear process for the homeowner to respond within a reasonable window, and a formal right to appeal before any penalty could actually be enforced against anyone. Howard was elected as the new board president 2 weeks later, and one of his first actions in the role was mailing a short letter to every household on the street, apologizing for the way certain complaints had been handled, and inviting anyone with a disputed fine to request a review. Nearly a dozen homeowners responded within the first month. As for Marla, she stayed in the neighborhood, though she stopped attending meetings altogether, A few residents said they still saw her walking her dog in the evenings, keeping mostly to herself now, the same way Calder once had. Nobody organized a campaign against her, and nobody needed to. The record had already done what it needed to do. Calder went back to finishing the small wooden structure behind his house exactly as he had originally planned it, the same one Marla had once demanded he tear down within 72 hours or face consequences. He wasn't keeping it out of spite, and he never once mentioned Marla's name while building it. He simply no longer had to answer to rules that had never actually existed in writing in the first place. On a quiet afternoon several weeks later, Calder stood near the edge of his driveway with a cup of coffee in his hand, looking out at the yard he had spent so long quietly defending without ever raising his voice once. A neighbor walking her dog slowed down near the mailbox and offered a small, knowing smile. "Looks like you won," she said, tilting her head toward the finished structure behind the house. Calder shook his head slowly. "No," he answered. "Nobody won." He glanced back toward the house behind him, calm and unremarkable in the afternoon light, no different from any other house on the street. "The rules finally did," he said, and went back inside. If a camera could have pulled back slowly from that driveway, rising up over the rooftops and the trimmed hedges, it would have shown a house sitting quietly among dozens of others just like it, indistinguishable at a glance, except for the fact that it was, for the first time in months, completely at peace. No raised voices carried across the yard anymore. No new envelopes waited in the mailbox with official letterhead. No patrol car idled at the curb while neighbors watched from behind their curtains. There was only the ordinary hum of a neighborhood going about its Saturday, the sound of a lawnmower somewhere in the distance, a screen door closing 2 houses down, and Calder standing there in his own driveway with absolutely nothing left to prove to anyone. Months later, when people on the street talked about what had happened, they rarely talked about Marla at all. They talked about the folder, about how a man who almost never spoke at a single meeting had said more with a stack of paper than she had said in a year of letters, warnings, and phone calls. Denise eventually got her refund, along with a short note from Howard apologizing for the delay. The workshop behind Calder's house got a second coat of stain that fall, and by winter it looked as though it had always belonged there, as though none of it had ever been in question at all. Marla had believed, on that cold Saturday morning, that calling the police would finally force a quiet man into submission, that 2 officers standing on his porch would be enough to make him fold the way so many others already had before him. Instead, that single phone call became the exact moment when everything she had been hiding for months was finally dragged into the light, in front of people who had both the standing and the willingness to check every word of it against the record. She had spent a year assuming that authority meant never being questioned, and it took one folder, calmly handed to a police officer on a cold morning, to prove her completely wrong. And sometimes, the fastest way for someone who has spent years quietly abusing a small amount of power to lose all of it isn't a lawsuit, or a shouting match, or a public scandal manufactured by someone else. Sometimes it's simply letting them stand in front of the very people who can verify the truth, and watching them say it out loud themselves, one contradiction at a time, until there's nothing left to hide behind.